special session of the Town Council. Call the meeting to order and ask for roll call, please.
Mayor Schlum.
Here.
Vice Mayor Contino. Here. Councilmember Leger. Here. Councilmember Brown. Here. Councilmember Hanson. Here. Councilmember Elke. Here. Councilmember Dickey has not arrived yet.
All right. I think we'll probably expect her. All right. First and only item on the agenda is presentation discussion with possible direction of staff relating to the Town of Fountain Hills proposed budget for fiscal year 2011 and 12. I would imagine it's Rick first, and then probably the Julie show, potentially. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We come here today as nearing the end, but not quite there. When you start a process like the budget process back in October or August, this seems like it's close to the end, but it's really the beginning, because this is where we begin to get the clarifications, the directions, and the feedback from you, from citizens and others that interested in this important document. This is our primary policy statement for the town. It's not just a collection of numbers. We're very, very interested in any direction you have for us tonight and hereafter, so that we can put this important document together. We're very optimistic about our abilities to put together a document which is conservative, which is based on a new normal, which anticipates, we believe, a new economy that we're moving into, and which at the same time preserves some very critical service levels for our town. With that, any opportunity we have to get feedback from you is important as we try to clarify your direction to us. We therefore understand also that this document has not been in your hands for very many days, and nor has the public had a lot of time to look at this document. Therefore, we are proposing a few more days to meet with you on this, and in a special meeting to allow the public to provide some feedback at those meetings as well. And Shauna is arranging those meetings with you, and we'll post those, of course, when those are solidified. So with that, I want to turn some time over to Julie, and she's going to walk you through each portion. Please feel free to ask questions. We have our staff here. If we don't have the answers, we'll go get them really quick for you. But I'm thinking that the room contains just about everybody that can answer a question for you here tonight. And so with that, Julie, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thanks, Rick. Welcome, Julie. How are you doing?
Fine. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. As I bring this up, I first would like to take the opportunity to thank our Executive Budget Committee that met over the past few months and helped put this together, because it was really a large task, and without their help, I don't think we could have done it. And the committee members are Judge Eisenberg, Paul Mood, Mark Mayer, Rick Davis, Cornell Huey, myself, Councilmember Elke, and Mayor Schlum. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And as Rick said, please feel free to stop me at any time and ask any questions. I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but not too much. For the benefit of those who have not already seen this presentation, the plan for fiscal year 11-12, we see that the economy is showing signs of stability. We've had about 5 months now where we've had a slight increase in our retail sales tax, which is a good sign. The revenues that we have projected for fiscal year 11-12 next year do include a proposed increase in telecommunications utility sales tax from 2.6 to 4%. And again, this came out of the meetings with the Executive Budget Committee. Our general fund expenditures, which is our main operating fund, if we eliminate the public safety, meaning the police and fire, the increase was less than 1%. We did incorporate all the council goals, and then as usual, our capital projects budget is funded with the construction sales tax, and we don't anticipate much money to replenish that over the next few years. Some of the long-term concerns and issues that we have to pay attention to is obviously the prolonged economic recession, which has led to foreclosed properties, which obviously has a ripple effect, particularly when we lose population or we have properties that are either not paying their taxes or we no longer have residents here. We also have aging infrastructure, primarily the roads, and decreased proportionate share of the state shared revenues. Again, that's because of our decreased population and the increase in the surrounding cities that are growing much faster. As those cities get bigger and we stay the same, we lose proportionate share of revenues. And again, we have the lack of sustainable or diversified revenue source. We're primarily dependent on two sources of revenue, one being our local sales tax and the other being state shared revenues. Depending on state shared revenues, obviously, is a revenue source that we don't control, and as we saw this year, the legislature is very inclined to want to cut into the cities and towns' proportionate share of those revenues. And then we're also focusing on business attraction and retention and the implementation of our downtown vision plan. A chart here, this table just shows all funds revenues. Again, our general fund is our major operating fund, primarily pays for our police, our fire, our parks, our community center. All of that comes out of the general fund. And then you can see the total of all the other funds which are restricted for specific purposes is $32.4 million. Expenditures for all the funds in the general fund, expenditures are 12.9, which is 300,000 more than last year, which was 12.6. The HERF, or the Highway User Revenue Fund, which is again streets, is $1.3 million, and the total of all of that is 36.2. The reason that the expenditures are higher than the revenues is we are using some fund balance, particularly in the capital projects fund, to pay for capital projects. Some of the items that are included in the budget, proposed budget for fiscal year 11-12, there is no merit proposed for the employees. We did defray the cost of benefits. It would have been much higher, except that we passed on more of that to the employees in the way of higher deductibles, higher co-pays. Again, the proposal to increase the telecommunications tax to 4%. There's also the proposal, the initiative for the general obligation bonds in November for $29.6 million. Although we will not be spending 29.6 next year, it's more like 8.9, and again, that's for the Saguaro Boulevard project. And $10.5 million of the capital project funds will be utilized for capital projects over the next 5 years. And Paul Mood, our Development Services Director, will come up and talk about some of the projects that were shifted around to accommodate that. We also have the community contracts that we have reduced by 20%, and this is just a chart showing the contracts that are included in community contracts and where they were 2 years ago, where they were last year, and what we're proposing for next fiscal year. And again, they've all been reduced by 20%. We also reduced a transfer from the general fund to the community center. We transfer every year $387,000, and that pays for the bonds on the community center. And because we have been transferring and there's a bit of a surplus in that fund, we will be reducing that fund by that general fund transfer by $193,000. Some of the two tools that we have available as a city or a town to balance our budget is we only have two options. We can increase revenues or we can decrease expenditures. And obviously, when we had anticipated that there would be no growth this next fiscal year of 12.6, which is where we're at this year, but as a result of the census and the population loss from 2005, that's been reduced down to 12.1, a $500,000 reduction. So the solutions that we looked at is that they be aligned with three principles. The first one, that the solutions are permanent and they're sustainable, because again, this is not a one-time or one-year fix that we're trying to do. It's actually almost forever. We want to preserve the organizational integrity. We don't want to break the organization down so we're no longer able to provide the level of service that we've been able to provide for the citizens. And we want it to be equitable. So as the Budget Committee went through that, the options that we looked at for revenues was increasing the sales tax on telecommunications. And those were the three options, to 3.1%, 3.6%, or to 4%. And the Budget Committee recommended to the 4%. The effect on the residents, or a typical resident, from increasing it from 2.6 to 4%, this chart is just a summary. On the typical water bill, and I have copies of those in the next few slides, it would be 71 cents per month. On a typical Cox bill, 42 cents. And if you had SRP, Quest, and a cell phone, the total would be $5.43 a month. And this is a copy of an SRP bill showing that the typical, is this SRP? Yes, it's SRP. The monthly charge is $145, so the current tax on that is $3.79. If it was increased to 4%, it would be $5.84, so the difference would be $2.05. And this is Chaparral Water. Again, this is a typical water bill on a residence, about $55, and the difference there is 71 cents. A Quest bill, the difference on that would be about $1.20. 86 is about average for residents on their phone bill. And this is a Sprint, or Cox. This is Cox cable telephone, and that monthly, the tax on that would be $1.20 as opposed to 78 cents. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions there. If there is, if you just want me to keep going, I can do that as well.
I think we can keep going. Thanks.
Some of the expenditure options that we looked at were staff pay cuts of 10%, but the committee felt that that was not sustainable. We have cut staff over the past 3 years, and this would not be a long-term solution. Same with staff furloughs. Eliminating programs would just reduce the level of service to the community. We did recommend reducing community contracts another 20%, meaning from last year they took a hit as well. Utilizing rainy day funds, that would be just a one-time thing. We would still have to have this discussion again next year. Same with eliminating funding for vehicle replacement. That would just buy us time for 1 year, but we still would have to deal with this again next year. And also, we did propose and include restructuring that debt payment for the community center for $193,000. And then we considered and talked about at a work study reducing the law enforcement contract from 3.8 beats to 3.4 beats, but that was not recommended. So there's only two things in the expenditures that were proposed and are included in the budget, and that is reducing the contracts and restructuring the debt for the community center. I'll just briefly go over the departmental expenditures. This is a chart showing where all the general fund, again, our operating budget goes, and you can see that police and fire are 46% of the budget, with development services, which is public works, 13%. Community services is recreation, community center, seniors, and then administration at 20%. The court, these two charts, the chart on the left is a breakdown by program, and the chart on the right is a breakdown by the line items. So each department has this exact same breakdown. And I'm happy to answer any questions, but I won't go over what every one of the programs are for every one of the departments. This is a chart on the administration expenditures, again by division, not by program, but this is by division, and then by line item on the right side. Total expenditures is $2.6 million. Development services, again, this is public works, engineering, facilities, planning, building safety, and that's $1.6 million. Community services, which is parks, community center, recreation, seniors, that's $2.2 million. Law enforcement, and that's the contract with MCSO. In addition to, we have animal control in there as well as the jail fees. That is in the law enforcement budget, and that total is $2.9 million. Fire department is $3.2 million. And we have other funds. Again, other funds are restricted. They can only be used for the purpose that they were set up. Streets, that is from highway user revenue funds, which is a gasoline tax. It's a shared revenue, and that's $1.3 million, and those funds can only be used for streets. And then downtown development, economic development expenditures, that is the downtown portion of our local sales tax that can be used for the downtown or economic development, and that total is $234,000. At this point, I will turn it over to Paul Mood, our Development Services Director, and he will update the council on the 5-year CIP or Capital Improvement Plan.
Thanks, Julie. Welcome, Paul.
All right, thank you, Mayor and Council. I know this is kind of hard to see, so I put some copies on your chairs there so you can see it a little bit better. When you received the CIP back in April, you received this document. Basically, it showed $25 million worth of projects over the next 5 years funded by the CIP fund. Unfortunately, we only have about $10.5 million in the CIP fund. So the Executive Budget Committee, we talked about moving projects out into the future and funding what we really need to do in the next 5 years. So this first slide shows what we would propose funding over the next 5 years, and it gets you to roughly the $10.5 million, and you can see it leverages a lot of matching Prop 400 money, federal aid, our funds, and some grants. One thing to point out is the S6008 project, the annual payment management. We currently have $2.4 million of CIP fund budgeted over 5 years, plus $9.9 million of bond funds should the street bond pass in November. If that street bond does not pass, your CIP fund goes up close to $4.5 million. So it's going to take away from a lot of other projects. So that's one thing we have to keep in mind. The next slide shows the projects which we pushed out. We did have a lot of, the Elman Development Agreement includes a lot of drainage and traffic signal projects should the capacity from that development ever warrant them, and their agreement states that they're responsible for part of the costs. So those were always parked in year 5 of the CIP program, so we just didn't forget about them. But now we moved them out into year 6, so they don't show up in the first 5 years. But if the Elman project does come online, we'll get additional construction sales tax that'll come in. And should these projects be warranted, we can go ahead and move forward with them. Some of the projects of note that we did move out, the streets maintenance facility improvements of $1.8 million, fire station number 2 relocation of $2.25 million. I guess if there's a grant opportunity in the future, we can look at applying for that again. A lot of parks projects we moved out. We moved out the annual sidewalk projects. That's $950,000. We also moved out $225,000 of the downtown sidewalk program. Now, the current fiscal year CIP has approximately $35,000 in there for downtown sidewalks, and staff would like to propose that we finish off the sidewalk on the south side of the avenue just east of the town hall here, and then there's also the property just west of Bashes on Palisades. We think we could go out and get bids from local contractors and get that work done, but we need to do it very quickly because we need to get the bids in and the work completed by June 30th. So those are the 2 areas that we feel that people are really using that should have a sidewalk in the downtown area. We also moved out a project for the Saguaro Boulevard Service Road elimination. The town was not successful in getting a grant, but we'll look for opportunities to reapply should a grant come up again. And then we also moved out the Fountain Hills Boulevard sidewalk project. That's from Cholla to Crystal Point. I also put a map on your chairs so you can see the limits of that project. Originally, that was a sidewalk that would go all the way to Shea, but the grant actually just cut we applied for $1 million grant and they just gave us $300,000. So we would have to spend roughly $280,000 of town money to get $300,000. And I don't know if that sidewalk really warrants it. So that's some direction we need to know pretty soon too if we want to move forward with that project or keep it moved out. And that project would actually go away because the grant has timing requirements in it, so we can't move it out 5 years. We could probably move it out 1 year and defer it and still get the grant, but we would need some direction on that. And that is the proposal for the CIP, if there's any questions.
All right, Paul, thanks. Any questions for Paul, going backwards on the CIP first? Or it does concern me what you shared about the $4 million plus that would have to be spent this year out of the CIP, which is at, what, $10 million?
It would be over the next 5 years.
The $4 million would be over the next 5 years?
for pavement maintenance.
If there is not, if the bond isn't passed? So you said it.
Yeah, Mayor, Councilmember, that's correct. The pavement maintenance, should, the bond not pass, would actually roughly be about $4.5 million over the next 5 years. And that's only for the current level of treatment we're doing. That's no mill and overlay. That's just the TRMSS, crack seal, and slurry seal.
Okay, we'll probably talk more about that one. Councilmember Dickey.
Thank you. Mayor, the 35 million for the downtown sidewalk plan, where is that on the, would that be on the first page then, since that's the stuff that you are gonna do?
35,000?
35,000, what did I say, it's a million?
I said million.
Yeah, you said million. I was worried for a second there.
Yeah, very.
That you just said that would be like, by bashes.
Yeah, Mayor,
Where was
Councilmember Dickey, that's currently programmed in FY10. This is FY11 through 16.
Okay, and so, and those are the ones that are
And
gonna,
it needs to be expended by June 30th.
thank you.
Hey, Councilmember.
Thank you. It's not directly for Paul. I just want to kind of, being on the budget committee, just kind of summarize what we're dealing with. And please, staff, if I misstate any of the numbers, I know we got a lot of numbers we're kicking around here. I just want to make sure, just to kind of bring it all together. This year, staff were anticipating a shortfall based on the state shared revenues of about $400,000. So we budgeted, or the staff anticipated that. What it ended up being was $915,000. So what we're dealing with this year, the shortfall for our expenditures are about $515 million. So 515,000. Thanks, Councilmember Dickey. Put that million in my head. 515,000. We should be so lucky, right? So really, what the staff and what we did through the budget discussions was we look at it big picture. Do we want to look at is this going to be a short-term thing? Are we going to make some cuts, use some rainy day funds, or are we going to look at this in a long-term type perspective to be sustainable over a long period of time? Now, the $915,000, that's what we're going to have to be dealing with next year as well. So the shortfall is, as Julie said, or Ms. Getty said, this is our reality as far as year in and year out. So fortunately, it's only $515,000 that we have to make up this year. But again, and I would hope as far as our discussions and at least the direction of the staff, are we looking at something this year that we're going to just fix this year as far as make up the shortfall? Because if we were going to do that, we can just spend rainy day funds and make up. I think coincidentally, the funds in the rainy day fund coincide with the shortfall that we have, which is about $515,000. Or do we want to look at something long term? And some of the savings or some of the cuts to get to that $515,000. The savings with the community service contracts about $72,852. And restructuring the debt is $193,005, so that's about $266,352 to get to that $515 for this fiscal year. And I did have one question for you, Julie, if I could, please. During our executive session, there was some discussion. We kind of kicked around the idea if we use some capital CIP funds of, I think it was about $2.5 million to pay down the bonds that we have presently, there was going to be some savings. I didn't see anything in the literature. Can you speak to that, or can you provide some information about that as well?
Yes, Mayor, members of the council, we did look at that. We contacted the financial advisors and talked to them about the feasibility of using some CIP funds to pay off our bonds early, and if they would give us any savings and what those savings would be. That was an option that we could do if we wanted to take, and I thought it was $2.5 or $2.9 million, and we would save about $300,000 a year in debt service payments that we could use in the general fund. However, we would have to somehow figure out how we're going to replenish the capital projects fund with that amount of money, which of course would be up to the council if they wanted to pay off those bonds early.
Councilmember Dickey.
Mayor, thank you. Councilman Elke or Julie, when you were prepared for the $400,000 and so that it would be, that we thought was going to be shortfall this year, did you take care of that with anything that would be permanent? So that, in other words, instead of looking for $915,000 worth of permanent cuts now to get us through pretty much forever, was any of that already something that would be sustainable, or was it all just like, let's do this so we can get through this year, and oh darn, now there's 500,000 more?
Mayor, members of council, basically what we did back in December and January, because we anticipated a slight bump in revenues, we also anticipated an increase in public safety contracts. So what we did is we pulled every other department down and said, this is what your budget amount is. The things that were left out are, maintenance things that we're just pushing off and pushing off. We have some permanent things in the budget. Obviously, we've done some staff layoffs and don't see them coming back. So definitely there are some, maintenance items, things that we really need to do that we've not been able to do. They were not in the budget back in January, and they're not in the budget now.
Thank you, because, when we talk about the raising the taxes, trying to figure out, are we trying to make up the $900,000 for, was there anything that could offset that so that we could look at the different tax rate, you know what I mean? So if that's not out of the question, it's probably hard to figure out exactly what might have ended up being permanent, but if it's something that's at least that we can discuss, I'd appreciate that.
Mayor, members of the council, what we did talk about at the budget committees, we did talk about the different levels of the tax for the communications, and what we came to an agreement is that we didn't want to solve the problem just for 1 year. If we didn't increase it enough and just met that amount, we would be back a year from now when all those contracts and when the costs of doing business go back up again. And so what we were trying to do is, one of the principles that we were following is that it was sustainable and that we were looking at the long term, not just the 1 year fix.
Right.
See if this is on. Mayor and council, one thing that we want to be very careful about clarifying is the proposal that's before you, while it is a longer-term solution than just a 1 year solution, it is not a permanent solution. And in fact, out beyond 2015, 2016, we began to see a deficit emerge. So it is not a permanent fix, and I heard that kind of reference. I just want to make clear you understand that this is a longer-term solution, but it's not a permanent solution.
Councilor Elke?
In the interest of full disclosure of everything, out here, I know during some of our budget discussion meetings, based on this $12.1 million budget, I know I'd heard from some of the department heads that we're not doing some of the things that we would normally be doing year in and year out. And I'm curious if some of the department heads could speak to that, what things that you would normally be doing in the normal course of business that aren't being done because of the funding issues. And I just want everyone to understand that this 12.1, where we're at, we're not operating at, I guess, where we would normally be or would like to be as far as the town's concerned. That's not to say expending all sorts of money, but there are certain things, vehicle replacement, et cetera. But I'd like to hear from the department heads to that.
I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
Just then also to preface that, also prior to Mr. Mood being with us, as council knows, our general fund budget was between 17-18 million several years back, 3-4 years back, and now we're potentially, if there's no revenue enhancements, or whatever these are being called, at about 12.1, and then without the public, if you take public safety out of that mix, it's roughly about $6 million. $17 million budget, $6 million out for public safety, left us $11 million to pay for all these things that we're talking about in the general fund. Left $11 million several years back, now at $12 million roughly, and $6 million for public safety. Now we're at $6 million to pay for everything else, parks and roads and those types of things. So close to a 50% reduction in overall spending at the town level for operating budget, which are the things that the citizens see and feel. And there's a lot of things to be said about that, and obviously the staff needs to be lifted up for delivering a tremendous amount of quality services for almost 50% of what we were spending several years back. But we also did, as Julie alluded to, or Rick alluded to, we went from 88 full-time equivalent employees to budgeted down to 61, so we said goodbye to a lot of our town staff. And largely, the building demand slowed, and a lot of folks were removed in those areas affected by construction drops, but still roads, parks, and other things need to be maintained and service delivered. So staff needs to be lifted up constantly, I think, for doing a tremendous job with less. Of course, they haven't been given any salary treatment for a number of years either, but the challenges now get even harder this year, when we expected to see some things starting to flatten out. Then we got hit with the census numbers, as Councilmember Elke alluded to. I think it's about a $900 and some thousand surprise that came to us, I think, in March. So that obviously became quite a challenge. So that's the only reason why any type of increase in revenue is being considered, was really the census numbers being a big surprise, and in fact our census being dropped. In addition to the revenue picture and census numbers dropping our revenues, the town of Fountain Hills long-term is going to continue to grow at a slower pace than the rest of the communities like Maricopa and Gilbert and other communities, so our piece of the revenue share pie will continue to get smaller. Unfortunately, the entire pie has gotten smaller with the dramatic decrease in the economy. But we have some challenges. I think we're been given good guidance and good heads up as quickly as possible from staff to help us through this. I think the Executive Budget Committee did some wonderful work again this year, but we're far from having any decisions made on some of these more sensitive items, and that's where we're at, because we're so deep into the budget and we have to cut so much that these items are not easy to come to agreement on. So I know we'll have a good discussion tonight, and we'll continue it throughout this month with the help of staff guiding us with the appropriate information. But I think Councilmember Elke brought up a great point. Let's hear some of the things that you've had to do without, because I think in the public, when I talk to citizens out there, they don't notice a great deal of change apart from the roads, I think. You hear quite a bit of that, but what have we not been doing? What might we see in the future?
Sure. Mayor and council members, thank you. The first part I want to talk about is actually the streets in the HERF fund. It's not the general fund, but the HERF fund. Obviously, we got a reduction in HERF fund. We had anticipated about a $100,000 reduction, but then we were hit with about another $150,000 reduction on top of that. The HERF fund pays for the general streets operation. It doesn't pay for the pavement management that we do each zone, once a year. That comes from the capital projects fund, so I want to make that clear. The HERF fund is paying for the day-to-day operations of the streets department. That street sweeping gets paid out of that at roughly $200,000 a year. We have about $100,000 in insurance. Part of the attorney's fees we pay because there's a lot of liability and contracts with the streets department. The traffic signal maintenance, your landscape maintenance with the medians and things like that. So before the HERF fund got reduced again, we had a fairly balanced street budget. What we had to do to make up the difference is we had Charlie Fleck recently retired, and he was doing our open space maintenance. We are not filling that position. That's no longer there. Raymond Reese, our environmental planner, is taking over the wash maintenance contract and our dam maintenance contract that Charlie did. And Jeff Larson, our mechanic, is going to manage the open space contract with the medians that you see going on. So basically our median maintenance is 2 guys, and they just keep going around in a circle. And, as we add more landscaping and whatnot, it takes them a little bit longer to keep doing it. So we also have Peter Petrata, who's a traffic signal tech that works part-time. He'll probably no longer be with us after the fiscal year. We would look not to replace that position as well, and hopefully work on an IGA with the city of Scottsdale to have some backup because we'd be down to 1 traffic signal technician. So those are kind of the things that we're dealing with in the streets department. We're just basically maintaining the same level with less people right now. On the general fund side, in the planning department, we had a half-time planner retire, so that didn't get filled. Obviously, there's less stuff coming in, so we're making up we're able to make it up now, but it's just added work for one person to do. Our planning department's basically down to one person now. Most of the general fund stuff that we've been putting off is facilities maintenance. I've got a wish list, 4 pages long. Just some of the things is the town does not have. We have a vehicle replacement fund. We do not have an equipment replacement fund. We have probably $750,000 of chiller equipment in the physical plant that had funding cut for maintenance, and it's getting up there in age, 10, 11 years old. So, we're not putting any money in a fund to replace that at some point. We have some roofs on some of the buildings that are aging, some of our older buildings that we just keep doing patchwork. At some point, those roofs are going to need to be replaced. I know we did use some contingency fund to fix some pumps over in the physical plant and a couple air handlers, one at the library, one at the community center, but there's many more. There's a lot of little maintenance items that keep getting pushed off just so we can run the facilities day to day. And at some point, those are going to catch up with us. We're not putting money away for it, so eventually we'll be up here asking for contingent. I can't tell you when. I know our facilities guys do a good job with what they have, but at some day we're going to have to be asking for contingency money as things replace. I think the air conditioner at the Kiwanis building that does the kitchen, I think the restrooms, is 20 years old. So that's on its last leg. So it's just little items like that we keep pushing off.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions for Mr. Mood? Good, thank you. Mr. Mayor, how are you?
Fine, sir, thank you. Our situation is much like Paul's in the sense that we have also been deferring maintenance in some of our parks. I had an opportunity to take the Park and Rec Commission on a park tour yesterday, and one of the parks commissioners asked me about the condition of some poles, and it's one of the items that we've deferred. These are at Golden Eagle Park. There are a series of those that have rusted to the point that we're a little concerned that they're going to last another year or so, especially when we get some high winds. We also have been deferring the maintenance on some of our trees, especially the high top trimming. Those are the ones that are most susceptible during high wind events to trees blowing over. We can get to the smaller stuff, but even with the borrowing the truck boom from the streets department, we're not able to reach or handle some of those larger tree branches, and so we're concerned about that. We also would like to have effectuated some repairs to the Fountain Park lights, which we've not been able to do that this last year, current year, and now it's not in next year's budget as well. We have a replacement shade structure at Four Peaks Park that needs to be replaced. We have not been able to include that in the budget as well. And then finally, looking forward, we're also looking at some point we're going to need to be pruning the trees that have recently been planted through the greening program. And we do not have any funds currently, nor do we anticipate any for next year as we start to do that, most of which we can do now, but within a year or two they'll be tall enough that it'll be difficult to reach at best. So those are just a few of the things that we put together for the parks. There are many, many more, but those are the ones that, at least from Don's perspective as a park supervisor, he felt like we were most in need of.
Good, thank you, Mark. Any questions for Mark at this point? Councilmember Dickey?
Mayor, thank you. Mark, will the closing of Four Peaks have any effect on us? I know we had IGAs as far as who did the lighting and maintenance of fields and things like that. We did the sidewalk, but we already did that. So I wanted to know if that was going to have any ramifications to our budget. And also maybe when we talk about public safety, I wondered if having the building not be used, would that have any ramifications on our public safety also? But that's not for you, obviously. Thanks.
Sure. Mayor Slum, Councilmember Dickey. Under the agreement that we have existing with the school district now, the only effect that I can really see is that park usage on what I would call the school side of the wash was largely restricted during the day if there were any physical educational activities taking place at that time. So in essence, that likely will go away, I would assume, with the kids no longer being at that particular campus. We are concerned though, however, and I know the school district has indicated that they will continue to maintain the building. Obviously, that whole campus is a large part of that whole park project. So, assuming that they're able financially to keep up with the maintenance on the grounds, et cetera, I really don't anticipate any significant problems.
I think same. Other questions for Mark at this time? Good. Thanks a bunch, Mark, for the rundown. Summary of that. Julie, I liked what you shared on the onset, and I think it answered some of the things, since this is what I think maybe Rick coined it. I'm not sure who gets credit, but our new normal. And the fact that the approach to the budget solutions is to be permanent and sustainable. We're not really hoping tonight or throughout the budget process that we come up with a solution that's just good for this year and something we have to reformulate entirely next year. We want to have something because we don't expect revenues to jump tremendously or have opportunity to do many of the things that were just mentioned next year or the following year. So we need to keep in mind that this is our new normal. Revenues are not going to be climbing, and in fact, are they going to climb as much as inflation goes up and our cost goes up? Probably not. And I know there are those factors of cost going up. You hear about it with healthcare in particular, and you address some of that, passing along some of those costs back to the employees as well, or more of that cost to the employees. Are there areas in this proposed budget that we can go over, at least at a high level, where we are increasing our spending as a town in the general fund? Are there areas that come to mind where we are increasing our spending?
Mayor, members of the council, really the only areas that we're increasing is in public safety. The other budgets have been held completely level last year and this year, so there is no increases. We've had to absorb any increases that would be in employee benefits, which is health care. There's no raises or any of that, but we've had to absorb those or any other costs in contracts or landscaping contract. We've absorbed those, with other line items. So really the only changes we could make now will definitely affect level of service and definitely affect programs within the town.
But if the budget is not at 12.1 million, but in fact at that higher number you had shared, is that because there's a consideration of enhancing revenues by increasing that telecom tax?
Mayor's member of the council, yes, actually there is. As we said, we included in the proposed budget a proposal of increased revenue in the telecommunications tax. What we also included was a contingency in the general fund that in the event that A, we do pass that tax, that B, we can come back to the council and say, okay, the tax is coming in, it is what we expected it to be, then we have some flexibility at that time to revisit any expenditures that come up that we haven't planned for or weren't able to do. So in other words, there is a little bit of flexibility in the budget. But one of the things that we need to consider is that the issue of increasing the telecommunications tax is at least 120 days out from whenever the council makes the decision. We have got to notify the public 60 days before we make a decision that we want to increase the tax. And then after that, when the council approves it, there's a 60-day period before it can be in effect. So we have that contingency amount in the general fund budget, but we may need it because the revenues may not come in or it may not get approved till we're halfway through the year. So it's not something that we programmed in the budget as an expenditure. It's there as a contingency.
Okay, and on the public safety front, what are our costs going to be looking like this year as a percentage or an increase?
Mayors, members of the council, the contract with the rural metro has a 3% increase in their budget for 5 years or 3 years? Was it for 3 more years? Last year, meaning this year that we're in right now, fiscal year 10-11, they did not charge us that. But this year for 11-12, they are charging us. The law enforcement contract is a full cost recovery contract, which means whatever those costs are for the number of beats that we require, those costs are passed on to us. And it was about a 5.5% increase for fiscal year 11-12.
So outside of increasing our spending basically to cover cost for MCSO and rural metro for fire, we're not increasing spending in other areas in the general fund?
No, Mayor.
But that would not account for inflation either? I mean, just year-over-year spending is what you're saying? Year-over-year spending is not being increased, not year-over-year spending with inflation calculated in there or higher cost calculated in there?
No, Mayor, this proposed budget this year, if you take out public safety, it's less than a 1% increase for all of the other general fund, the parks, everything,
Okay.
if I'm understanding your question.
Yeah, I'm probably not asking it very well, but I just wanted to level set where we're at and where I thought we were at. We're not looking at increasing spending. Okay. Town Manager Davis?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, if there's any variance between line items this year and last year, it's not the product of our application of any inflationary factor. There was no anticipated inflation at all. There's no factor we applied.
But I'm just saying, probably more for the public, a lot of times you hear about spending not increasing, but then it also often is calculated because of an inflationary factor of this percent, but we're not even including that.
No.
Okay, good. All right, council, we're going to talk about this a couple more times this month, but there are a couple of items that are obvious for us, and I know there's people from the public, and if the public wants to speak, there's a card in the back, and I think we've already collected some. If you want to speak on this item, you certainly can tonight, and we'll start calling for cards here shortly. Council, anything else you want to talk about before we ask for comments from the public? Councilmember Hanson.
I think it would be really helpful for us and the members of the community if since staff has kind of made lists of things that they're deferring or having to go without, if we could kind of commit that to paper and, you know, make like a shopping list of all the things that we're going to be going without or that will have to be reduced. I talked to Rick about this earlier today. I think it helps to make it more clear, you know, what the community is giving up without having funding sources. And I think if it's something like maybe even programs in Parks and Rec, you know, things that we won't have next year. So we can put, you know, names and actual concrete projects and things, rather than just saying revenues up or revenues down and, you know, just the number game.
I think that's great, especially that makes a lot more sense even in a small town like us here. I think that's a great idea. Councilmember Dickey?
Kind of along with that, Mayor, there are intangible things that are a little bit hard to put your finger on that we're not going to do. I was just thinking of how this one entity had called about doing a cover story about Fountain Hills. It was, you know, just a minor thing, but it was one of those things where you're like, who do you call? You know, when everybody's so busy, it's difficult to say, okay, who would you call to meet with this person who'd like to do this cover story? Because you have to do research and you have to, you know, do things like that, and that's not going to come across. But it would be, I mean, it might not be an easy thing to do, but it would be worthwhile if there were things like that could also be shown. Well, the other thing was, we had that big meeting with the 5 communities, the Arizona You Want, and it was an opportunity to compete in the state. And if you got it, then you would, you know, it's the kind of thing we talk about, like getting people to want to come here. We'd have national attention, but it's almost too much to bear to just say, well, let's try to do that, because everybody's just trying to get day to day. So there are intangible things that we can't do because of time and the research that would be involved. So if that could somehow be even just a sentence with what Cassie was talking about, I think it would be helpful to know that too. And those are things that are so gradual that you don't really see them happen. So it's just food for thought.
Good, thank you. Council, any more ideas along that line of thought? I think also that our community's also been always been huge on volunteers, and the organizations leading the way in the town kind of facilitating or supporting those organizations, and we've seen more folks step up to answer the calls for more events, and not us funding those events, but us facilitating those events or supporting those events. So that's an example perhaps of a positive thing of us pulling back a little bit, is allowing the town citizens in particular to step up and to affect that thing that they value most. So I think at this point we can take some items from the public. Does that sound good, Council? All right. Bev, do we have some folks who want to speak on this item?
I have no cards.
Okay, no cards tonight. And then there may be a card. I see someone sprinting with a paper now when I mentioned that. So, it was mentioned tonight at our next meetings, Rick, are we also expecting to be able to take comments from the public as well?
Council, we would like to format the next meeting very much like this one. And we'll again go over some of the specifics, hopefully include some of the information we didn't before. Like the idea very much of composing that list that you mentioned, including some of those hard and softer costs or items or programs that we won't be able to afford in the coming budget. And certainly be open to public comment again.
And also for folks in the public or in the audience here, go ahead and forward your ideas or suggestions to staff or to council as well, so that we can perhaps include those in our next budget discussion. Also, if you're not able to get up or you don't think of that item tonight, if you think of something, go ahead and forward it to us. But we do have a speaker card now.
Mayor, you might
Councilman.
want to mention that the budget did go live on the website.
Oh, good, thank you. Councilmember Hanson just reminded me to mention that the budget is on the internet, on the town website now, so thank you.
Audra Custer-Thomas, followed by Andy Bell.
Thank you. Welcome, Audra.
Welcome. Great to be here, members of council, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Davis, Ms. Getty. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'll be honest, I simply haven't had enough time to look at the budget. Contrary to page 91, which outlines in parts the entire budget schedule, first time I noticed the budget being online was yesterday morning. I had checked on Friday. The budget schedule does say it was going to go up last Monday. And so in the last 30 hours, I've slept and worked and just had a couple hours actually to page through the document to provide some feedback to you this evening. First off, there are just more comments really and reactions as opposed to feedback. Fortunately, I don't know how much feedback I can provide. There seems to be a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to the activities and outcomes and performance measures. I think I noticed a difference from last year's budget that instead of programs evaluated and a budget outlined via program, this year it looks like we're looking at it in a division concept. But each of those divisions use different performance measures or don't use performance measures, or use outcomes or don't use outcomes. Various nomenclature, and then half of the operating budget, which is law enforcement and fire EMS, there are no performance measures whatsoever. And having been part of the Citizens Academy, both the new captain and the chief provided some great information, anything from service calls and some quantifiable and even qualitative information, which seems to me would be a great thing to put in the budget. But I didn't see any of that there, which was interesting. I also personally love to see the strategic plan front and center in the document. However, I'm not certain exactly how it's being utilized within the budget itself. Only a small number of the specific fiscal year 11-12 council outcomes or initiatives are actually cross-referenced throughout the budget, and I had to do that by hand. I had to page through each page to find them, and I only found a handful of them. Furthermore, even a fewer percentage of those actually had costs or funding source related to them. Councilwoman Dickey just made a comment about the Arizona We Want. That's one of your council initiatives and outcomes listed in this budget, but I couldn't find it outlined specifically. So I'm not certain if they're just not being addressed or if they're buried somewhere else within the document. So that's kind of an inconsistency I wasn't able to follow. There's inconsistent use of the telecommunications tax and the telecommunications and utilities tax. I believe, Ms. Getty, that it's the increase of 4% to both the telecommunications and utilities privilege tax. But we often talk just about the telecommunications component, but I think it's both of them that's part of the proposed increase. And so in general, I know that's my time. Oh, how awful.
Take another minute, Ms.
Absolutely, I'll continue. I'll go quick. So although I have a lot of local budget experience personally, and I've actually even been intimately involved in Fountain Hills' budget process, I'm not sure the general public or even I could really decipher a lot of information to provide feedback to you other than, wow, our future looks really bleak, which I don't know that any of us are in disagreement with. So a couple of suggestions that were brought up tonight I think are great. Let's talk to what this budget really means in terms of reductions or eliminations of programs, and let's look at long-term solutions, whether they're program cuts, not just reductions, or long-term revenue solutions, as was outlined already. And I would very much advise against use of the rainy day fund for a long-term problem. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Sasha. And we'll look forward to forwarding anything else you see now that you'll have the budget now before we get together next time.
Andy Bell?
Good evening, Ms. Bell. How are you?
Hello, Dave. I'm well.
Good.
Thank you very much, everyone. Honest to goodness, I have not read the 300 pages. I give you lots of kudos, respect for all your work. I just have some questions that you might want to think about because I'm just a single income earner and I understand budgets. What I see sitting here and reading the little bit I have is, on one hand, we as a town are doing projects in conglomeration with citizens like greening of ground downtown or greening of around the park. That's terrific. But we also have an expense to our parks and rec that we pick up. We are in a fiscally very difficult time. I'd like you to think about things like adding sidewalks down La Montana. I mean, I live around there. We've been in a town for 41, 42 years. Sidewalks used to be put up when we were prior to incorporation. People would be asked to donate. They'd get a plaque like down Fayette. I have many plaques there in remembrance of people. I would just recommend thinking of perhaps not doing what we absolutely don't need. What Mark brought up about safety, that's important. Sidewalks, if we haven't needed them in 41, 42 years, maybe not. My other comment, and then I'll go away, is I saw a budget of $122,000 to the Chamber of Commerce, $122,000 to the Chamber. I have zero against the Chamber. I'm not a member of the Chamber. But does the town of Fountain Hills charge the Chamber money for the 6 days a year that they get the Avenue of the Fountains and take business away from the downtown? So perhaps we could charge the Chamber for using the Avenue, and then we could maybe ask the Chamber to show us, the public, for the $120,000 what businesses get in return. On that note, I'll leave you, and hopefully you have a nice night.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. Now, any other, there's probably, then we can talk those items. Thanks.
One more card, Frank Serpico.
Welcome, Mr. Serpico.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. I have a lot of questions that I would like to ask. And before I start, I'd like to clear up one thing. I'm showing that there's a general fund budget of $12,000 or $12.9 million for the general fund, and $17.4 million for the capital expenditures. Is that correct?
We can talk to your questions after your call to the public. You have 3 minutes. I recommend going through those items. Maybe we'll take some notes and talk to some of those items.
Okay, because then my calculation says that it's $30.3 million for a budget, not the numbers that you're throwing around. For this 4% increase, what are those funds going to be used for? Specifically, what plan do you have to use those funds? Not just throw them into the general fund and then spend them as you see fit. Have you ever thought about reducing spending as part of balancing the budget rather than taxation? The other thing is, with the people that are not here because they've gone for the summer and they own houses here, you're taxing them. They don't have a vote. And, you know, somewhere that sounds like taxation without representation. So how are you going to handle that with those people? And I see that you've already had a 10% cut in funding across the board for your staff and members. I would propose that you increase that cut for the people. Last but not least, I understand that the town manager is in front running for another position in Oregon, in Wilsonville. He's going to have to be replaced. And when we do that, we hire somebody at a lesser expense. And as far as the vehicles go, have you developed a depreciation schedule for that so that we can plan ahead? And last but not least, how many people on the staff have private cars for their use that we furnish the town? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Serpico. Is there anyone else on the public? Yeah, we'll get to that. Nobody else, thank you. So we had some good questions, and there may be some folks that didn't speak up that might have similar questions, so maybe we can take a good opportunity. I think that this option and this item on the agenda, have folks come forward and we can talk to some of these items, and Councilmember Elke is probably looking in that direction also, and I'll ask you if you want to start or ask a question or follow up on what was just spoken.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw Paul making his way up here, or maybe you were just helping out Mr. Serpico and helping the crowd. But can we speak to, have someone come up and answer Mr. Serpico's questions with respect to private cars for staff, depreciation schedule? I know we've talked a little bit about that as far as the vehicles are concerned. Paul or Julie?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. As far as private vehicles for town staff, there is only one staff member who has a vehicle. I wouldn't call it a private vehicle. It is a town vehicle that is assigned to the town manager, and that's in his contract. No other staff has a town vehicle that they get to take home. The other question on depreciation for vehicles, we do have an annual depreciation that we call the Vehicle Replacement Fund. So all the vehicles and equipment is depreciated and money is set aside to replace those.
Just recapping just some of the questions. There was, Mr. Serpico asked a question about reducing spending and what are we going to be using any additional funds or any funds that we may receive as a result of any type of communication and utilities tax increase.
Yes, thank you. As far as reducing spending, we have cut spending from, as the mayor talked about, when we were at 17 million, now we're down to 12 million. And any further cuts, I mean, we can cut expenditures. If the council desires and tells us to cut, we'll cut, but it's going to affect the public. So far, we have cut expenditures without affecting level of service. Any expenditures that we cut now are going to reduce service. Either we will have to cut out recreation programs or close parks or eliminate things like code enforcement. There's no cuts that we can make that are not going to affect a program or a level of service at this point. And then as far as the telecommunications tax, that is a proposal that is going to replace the $900,000 that we are losing from the state shared revenues that would be in the general fund and would be used for those items that both Mark and Paul stood up for, things that we've not been able to do because of the impact that we've had over the last few years.
And the last one, Julie, was the numbers. Mr. Serpico cited a couple numbers, 12.9 million and then 17.3. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, Mayor, members of the council. The $12.9 million is what is in the general fund, which is our operating fund. Our total budget, as we talked about at the beginning, is $32 million. That includes our capital projects funding. For example, it also includes if the bond proceeds, if the bond election is successful. It also includes grant funds of about $4 million to do shade projects. So it's $12 million in the general fund, but there are other funds that come into the town that are restricted for a specific purpose. In other words, if the bond is successful, we have about $8.9 million programmed to do Saguaro Boulevard. That's the only thing we can do with that money. We can't do anything other than that specific project.
On that item, thanks for bringing those up, Councilmember Alke. There are two budgets, or there's actually other funds as well, but primarily capital and general fund. General funds are day-to-day operations, the thing that we can have more or less they control the day-to-day operations. That's what the citizens see. The capital fund are these items that have $17.3 million. If you take the $9 million out for the bond, if that can just be set aside if it's passed or not, leaves it about $8 million there. And what we're looking at doing is moderating how much we spend out of our capital fund, because not much is going into it without the construction going on, to about $2 to $2.5 million of our savings in that capital improvement fund being used each year. So the balance of which is what you just mentioned, grants. And sidewalks were mentioned, primarily built by grant monies, correct?
Since we've incorporated sidewalks?
Yeah, I mean, just like if we do sidewalks next year.
Either developers or grant funds.
Yeah, or developers.
Sidewalk, safety to schools, safe sidewalks to schools, those grants, and then developers, because most of the sidewalks are in front of private property, and so they're required to put in sidewalks.
Yeah. So if in fact we, at the end of, or before we wrap up our budget discussions, ultimately, if we go with the $12.9 million general fund, that would include a tax increase, in essence, this telecommunications and utilities tax, correct?
Yes, Mayor, that is correct. If there is no increase in the revenues, we will have to cut that back down to probably $12.4 million.
And obviously, I think Mr. Serpico got some good applause, and I'm assuming some of this is probably based on what happens nationally, because the budget nationally continues to go up, and obviously here it continues to go down. But the sentiment is, the concern is there with a lot of folks in the society in our city. Whether they're engaged or they're not engaged, they're assuming the town locally, government is spending more money. That's not been the case here, and that's not going to be the case here. But what's happening is we have been reducing spending from 17 to 15 to 13 to now 12 over the last several years. And we have had to remove positions in our budget, so we removed quite a bit of staff. And as just mentioned, there's a couple more positions that won't be backfilled, so removing additional staff, folks that are leaving through attrition, more or less. How about the summertime and the snowbird factor? I think Mr. Serpico made a good point, and I think it's interesting to talk to you about where revenues come from to fund things in our community. We don't have a property tax in Fountain Hills that funds town operations. Those go to sanitary district and schools and the county. Those don't come into the town to do general fund items at all. Can you talk about how we are funded and how that works? We love our snowbirds, but how do the dollars come and go here in the town of Fountain Hills?
Mayors, members of the council, snowbird or part-time residents do not pay a property tax, because the town of Fountain Hills does not have a general operating property tax. So they come in and have full protection of the parks or the police, the fire, and they can use the parks and the facilities in the community center. If there is a telecommunications or utilities tax, even if they're not here, they obviously will pay a tax on their water bill, which may not be much, but they will still contribute in that way. Other than that, part-time residents only contribute when they're here and only if they shop in Fountain Hills. If they shop and eat outside of Fountain Hills, then they don't contribute to Fountain Hills economy at all.
And we're kind of working backwards through Mr. Serpico's comments first, and then I want to get into the other ones. So I think we're good comments that you hear from folks here now and again. How about further cuts to staff? Have those been considered? I know there a couple have been mentioned. Where are we at as far as full-time equivalents in this next year's budget?
Mayor, members of the council, we are have no increases in staff proposed for next year. We've gone from 88 a couple of years ago, we're down to 61. And now with these other ones leaving, we're not replacing them, we're likely to go down lower than that. If we cut, and again, we can always cut the budget if the council wants us to, but it's going to affect programs. If we want to cut the budget and say we want to eliminate a recreation program, that recreation program is attached to a person that does other programs because now we have fewer people doing a lot more. So it will be very hard to eliminate just one program, but if we want to cut the budget, then we will eliminate several programs. So it will either be recreation programs, there's some things that we just can't cut. We can't cut law enforcement, we can't cut police or fire. So those things would be things like code enforcement, the quality of life issues, park programs, park staff, reduced maintenance of the parks. Those are the only things we have left. We don't have any other staff that are, doing the nice things. We've all, picked up and everybody is doing something from somebody else. So again, if it's the desire of the council, and I know you've not said that, we can cut the budget, but it's going to have an effect on the public, and we really didn't want to do that because that doesn't solve the long-term problem. Because next year, when people are complaining because they don't have any more recreation programs or the parks are looking bad, we're going to be back here trying to figure out the same thing we're trying to figure out now.
And going on back to Ms. Bell brought up dollars to the chamber, and I know that, and maybe folks in the public aren't as aware that that's a contract for service, just as we call them community contracts, but these are all contracts for service. We're in essence outsourcing work that the town would otherwise do. The Chamber of Commerce is obviously funding our tourism efforts and our branding and visibility in the area. Can you speak to the community contracts or maybe to that one in particular since it was brought up?
Yes, Mayor, members of the council. Actually, we do have a contract with the Fountain Hills Chamber for tourism, and they do provide reports as is required. Every month they provide reports of what their activity is and where they have spent those dollars.
Good. And those are available?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then projects that come forward through volunteer efforts and such, similar to the greening project, and it was alluded to, we don't have budget to maintain those trees once they start growing, hopefully, healthfully, in good size. That's going to add a cost to us. Can you speak to how we go about considering those options, or would you like us to take a stab at that?
Mayor, if I understand you correctly, if you're talking about like the greening project, probably more appropriate for Mark to come up and talk about that. Volunteers in general save the town a whole lot of money. And just in our area, we have a volunteer that comes up and sits up at the reception counter, so we've never had to fill that other position, several days a week. And that is a huge help. They contribute a lot of money to the town, and we're always happy to have them come in and help. But I'll let Mark address.
While he's coming up, I know that we had I think we invested several thousand, maybe 10,000 in landscape design. The town actually funded that, worked on some greening efforts that kind of got them started. We, I think, paid for a landscape architect or some of the planning work on the front end. But since then, Mark, maybe you can speak to the greening efforts raised, over $100,000 and given it directly into the town. But maybe Mark can speak to how do we manage that when there's folks that are generous enough that want to give towards a project, but it might ultimately cost the town on an operational front for years to come?
Mayor Slum, members of the council, you may recall, and you accurately stated that when we originally were working with the Greening Committee, one of the things that we'd asked is that the council provide some initial funding to do the design, and that's what was originally done. One of the goals of the Greening of Downtown Committee has always been the intent to try to raise enough money over and above what it costs to plant to try to put a fund together that would be a fund that would help maintain the trees over a long term. That's still their goal. You had mentioned $100,000. I think the figure is actually fairly close to $200,000 that they've raised now. And their efforts are going to continue. They've got another activity planned for a fundraiser, and in fact, I got a call today from somebody that I forwarded to them who was interested in making a sizable donation. So they're also interested in pursuing some additional grants. They've received, I believe, 2 so far from the State Forestry Department. They're interested in pursuing at least 1, if not 2 more of those. So I would not be a bit surprised if the revenues that they brought in exceeded $200,000. And is, like I said, it is their intent to set aside some of those funds, depending how much they can raise for long-term maintenance of those trees.
Another thing that comes to mind that's similar is the public art, obviously. Even more so, dollars contributed by private individuals to purchase art and give it to the town, but the town has ongoing expenses as far as insurance and upkeep to some extent, correct?
That is correct, Mayor Slum, members of the council. That's, I think, one of the real success stories of the town is that partnership that has existed between the Public Art Committee and ourselves. We now are close to possessing more than 100 pieces of public art worth more than $1 million. And the total investment on the part of the town has been pennies on the dollar in return for that. The sculptures themselves are maintained largely by volunteers under the SOS program. They come around every week and do a fourth of the total number of exhibits on display that are outdoors. They clean and wash them, and then we have a contract with a person that comes around because he has that expertise twice a year for a couple $1,000, goes through and removes all the wax, fixes any pieces that need to be repatinaed or have a scratch or something along those lines, and then re-waxes them. But that's really that, and then the insurance costs that you mentioned, which is relatively small on that many pieces, are the only expenses that the town has.
That comment that was shared reminds me of when the stimulus dollars were being discussed, and a lot of communities, and rightly so, were concerned because there were strings attached to some of these things. There were dollars that were continuing to be needed to fund efforts, beyond being granted the monies from the stimulus. And I think it was illustrated tonight, the staff is even on the capital project side, not going forward with funding potentially after grants where we're paying even just 50% of it, because most of our grants are funded at about 80% and 20% town match to build something that we could benefit from years to come. So these projects that are being donated by the citizens out of their desire and love for the community, there aren't really strings attached to the 2 that you mentioned. Are there others that are out there that you're aware of where we have to be concerned with ongoing costs?
No, the only other program that I could think of, again, where we is strictly utilizing volunteers is the Art Docent program. Again, no strings attached. We simply utilize a pool of volunteers that we have trained, and they take folks out and visit the various art pieces on a continuing basis over the winter months. So that's another one where, again, I think our expenditure is a fraction. They pay a small fee and get a commemorative mug in exchange for it, but there aren't really any costs, very little costs associated with that program as well, because it's all volunteer driven.
Good, thanks. I'll stop hogging the mic here, Councilmember Leger.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, staff, for your presentation. Julie, I have a few points I'd like to clarify, and then a few comments that I'd like to make. Looking at the budget, it appears that our projected revenue for FY 11-12 is $13.1 million, and our projected expenditures are $12.9 million. I know it's not a lot, but there's a little wiggle room there in terms of revenue to expenditures. I also noticed that we have a contingency fund of $313,000. So when I look at the offset between revenue and expenditures in the wiggle room, there's $500,000 there. Is that an accurate statement?
Mayor Slum, Councilmember Leger, that is correct. And as we said earlier, the reason that flexibility is in there is for the time that we will, if the telecommunications tax is approved, the time until we start collecting it, number one. Number two, an estimate of how much that's going to be. We're not going to really know until we start collecting it. So we didn't want to program the expenditures.
Sure. I understand that. And with respect to the assumptions of this budget, we're looking at, this budget is based on an increase in our telecommunication tax to 4%. That's an accurate statement?
That's correct.
Okay. We have, other options have been presented to council to increase by 0.5%, 1%, and then up to 4%. Okay. This evening, Councilman Elke mentioned an idea that caught my attention. He talked about the possibility of looking at our capital fund and moving monies from our capital fund over to pay down our debt. That's something I'd like us to explore a bit more. I think it's a good idea, and I'd like to see the pros and cons of that. I heard just off the top of someone's head this evening that would be a $300,000 savings. One might ask the question, well, that's taken away from our capital improvement fund, which we're not replenishing because we have a lack of construction sales tax coming in, obviously. I'm hopeful that will pick up in the next two to 3 years. I'm not real comfortable with increasing our telecommunication tax to 4%. I may consider something smaller than that, but that just doesn't strike me as something I could support, particularly in the fact that this budget includes a street bond, and we need to look at that as well. One of the things I'd like us to do is take another shot at our capital fund, our capital projects improvement fund. Just very quickly looking at this while we're chatting this evening, we have a $50,000 expenditure for design in Four Peaks Park. I think that certainly could be deferred. We have a $400,000 expenditure to replace the traffic signals at Palisades. We just did some improvements there. We have a $125,000 expenditure for our Centennial Circle. I support that project, but I think that number needs to be considerably reduced. We have an initiative for $150,000 for design of joint parks in our joint partnership with our schools. We know the schools are hurting. I understand that that's design work and will give us a jump start. We're in a serious situation here. I feel that we need to continue to tighten our belt. I think that these particular projects can be deferred. When I add those numbers up, that's almost $800,000 in capital. And when I hear $2.5 million to pay down our debt, now all of a sudden it's not 2.5, it's somewhere around 1.7. And that being said, and I'll kind of back off from there, I'd really like to see us explore that alternative to see what it does for us. Does that $300,000 that we gain have unintended consequences? I don't know. I haven't done the analysis. But moving this budget forward with the main assumption that we're going to be increasing our telecommunication tax to 4%, I have a really difficult time with that. And I'm more optimistic that next year we'll see an uptick in retail sales. The year after that we'll see an uptick perhaps in construction. So this notion about this long-term issue we have, I'm aware of that. We discovered that in 2006 when we projected our deficits. But I'd like to continue to move through, tighten our belt, do this year what we've done last year, and next year, if we have to take another look at telecommunication tax or something else, so be it. But I really like that idea, and I appreciate the fact that was put on the table tonight about paying down our debt. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Julie.
Councilmember Dickey.
Mayor, thank you. I do have a question, but before that, I just wanted to mention or ask Paul, if the bonds don't pass, we have to find $4.5 million more out of these capital funds, correct? If they don't pass.
Mayor, council members, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the pavement management program would be approximately $4.5 million over the next 5 years just to do what we've been doing all along, and it would be approximately a total of $8 to $9 million over the next 10 years, and that would almost effectively wipe out the capital projects fund without doing any other projects.
So that wouldn't address Saguaro Boulevard. It would just do the patching that we've been doing.
It would just be the crack seal, slurry seal, and some surface seal.
Oh, Mayor, and Paul, the point being, if we take money out of this to pay off debt, then, and the bonds don't pass, that would increase a lot what we couldn't do on this list. Because this is a 5-year project, this is not this year. These things are not this year. The question I had was, basically for Julie. Sorry that, you have to get up again, but, our SPAC commissioner, Audra, had mentioned some things about the budget, and I wanted to ask you, the stage that this budget document is in is not a final stage. If I remember correctly, some of the outcome, performance measures that I remember reading for MCSO and for Rural Metro were actually a little bit later than when we got this. Is there a chance that those things are still going to be added to this document?
Mayor Schlum, Councilmember Dickey, yes, this is a working document. What we were trying to do with the performance measures this year is we were trying to do two things. We were trying to tie it to the council goals, but at the same time coincide with the performance measures that can be compared to other cities and towns, which is a standard by the ICMA, International City County Management Association. So we're trying to marry those together. So it's definitely a work in progress, and as we try to bring those together, because definitely we want to tie it to the strategic plan and definitely want to tie it to council goals, but at the same time be able to have this document and be able to take our performance measures and compare them to other cities and towns. But yes, there's a lot of pieces that are still not in this, that we haven't finished to put in the document yet. It has been a long and laborious process.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rauke.
Julie, I think I recall there in paying down the debt, spending the 2.5 of the capital funds to pay down some of the debt. Was there some additional savings that the town would realize in there? Not only the $300,000 a year, but I thought that, if I recall correctly, there was something else, maybe on the interest or something else. Could you speak to that?
I can't remember the exact amount. There was some savings. When we talk about saving $300,000, that's really not saving. It's just we wouldn't be spending it, but we would be taking out of the capital projects and paying off and not having to make that payment. The actual savings, and I don't remember what that was, but over the life of the bonds, which could be 10 years or 15 years, was, I don't know if I remember, around $300,000 of real savings of, over the 10 years. But the $300,000 a year would just be, we're taking it from one pot, paying off another pot.
Right, you're spending down what we have in CIP, which, for lack of a better term, I guess, frees up that $300,000 that would then be general fund monies that could, one option would be go right back into the CIP fund to replenish it, or at least have that availability where it's freed up and it's not so tied as far as the spending. Is that correct?
Mayor, members, yes, that would be probably what we would recommend, is if we're going to do that, that we have some way to repay the capital projects fund.
One more thing there. One of the things that I found interesting, I just want to talk to you, I know we talked a little bit about sales tax, but in meeting with Ms. Giddy, it was kind of interesting. The sales tax revenues that the town earns over the course of the 12 months of each calendar year remain fairly static from month to month. I would expect, as I would think most of folks in the room would expect, that during the winter months when we have more snowbirds, that we'd see a dramatic spike because of the number of folks that are in town. But it's kind of interesting. It remains fairly static month to month as far as the sales tax revenues that the town sees. I did want to speak to one thing that Ms. Koster-Thomas had mentioned. There was great discussion in the executive budget meetings as far as performance measures on a variety of issues. So there was a lot of discussion as far as making certain things more stringent, more accountability as far as that's concerned. So there was a lot of discussion, although it may not be yet in this draft. Trust that there is going to be a lot of things that come out of the budget committee as far as performance measures, not only for the community service contracts, but I know we talked about a little bit as far as the departments as well. So that is something that was discussed.
Councilmember Hanson.
I saw a communication today that indicated that this may be one of the last opportunities that people would have from the public to comment on the budget. And then also referring to Audra's comment about the schedule that appears on page 91, for those of you who might review the budget, this schedule is kind of, it's a work in progress, and this is not engraved in stone at all. As the mayor said, we're going to have probably a couple more additional meetings. The council just got this budget last Thursday night, so I think there's some of us that haven't really gotten very far into it. So I think if we, just make it very clear that there is going to be additional opportunity for everybody to comment on this document, and that all ideas are welcome.
Yep, great. And I think the three folks that spoke tonight, those are great. We need more of those type of questions that people out there are thinking the same thing so that we can address them if we don't cover them, on our own here. Councilmember Dickey?
Thank you, Mayor. One more question about the money that's in the capital improvement. Is that money that we invest, because remember over this past year, we altered how we're investing so that we'll get more money back. Is that something that we do with that money, and is the interest reflected in the revenue on the budget?
Mayor Slum, Councilmember Dickey, that we are anticipating increased interest in the general fund, and that interest will come from our general fund balance. Any idle funds will be invested so that they can earn more earnings. The capital projects would have to be laddered so that whatever money we're spending this year, but anything we weren't spending would be invested, yes.
And Mayor, thank you. And where in when you have the revenue breakdown, where would interest income be reflected?
Mayor Shlom, Councilmember Dickey, it's in every fund. There is a line item. If you look on the page of the revenues, the very last one, it says interest earnings. And I think the general fund this year is under $10,000. Next year, we're projecting about $60,000.
And one other item that was mentioned is the breadth of the budget document. And I know to some extent that's our council members' fault. We keep asking for more to be added, different breakdowns, comparisons from year over year over year. And now that we have a program budget, we're able to actually compare numbers. So I think that's probably adding to the breadth of the document itself. But it's not because we're spending more. We're spending less, but we're breaking it out in more and more ways, and maybe even the font's a little bigger. So I think most of the changes I've seen are improvements, and I think Councilmember Hanson's brought up a lot of them as far as comparing things, and I think those type of inclusions in the budget are great to have in here. We didn't talk about our Moody's rating and that sort of thing. The organization that rates the health of communities and other organizations, how are we doing there?
Mayor Slum, members of the council, we actually met with our financial advisors a couple of weeks ago, and they were quite surprised that we were able to maintain our same rating with Moody's, and that B, we did not have to cut into reserves. We're one of the very few cities that have not had to cut into reserves for their operating budget. So I anticipate that with good leadership and good policies that will continue. We will continue our AA rating. We have a very good bond rating.
Okay, terrific. And how about the fee schedule? Are we going to be going over the fee schedule at our next meeting?
Yes, Mayor, members of the council, we're hoping for about 2 more work study sessions for the public and as well as for the council, and I believe that we want to do the fee schedule is one that hasn't been done, as well as the pay plan. Even though we don't have any increases projected, we want to make sure that we keep the pay plan up to date, so there's still some moving parts with this. And then as well as giving a final capital improvement plan budget and incorporating that in the budget document. Right now, they're 2 separate documents.
And the CIP plan, since that was opened up, I think it's a good idea. Are you going to need a little committee to work on this with some council members perhaps? Or, well, I'll just look for you guys to suggest which way we go about that, since we have a limited time here before we have to approve a budget, to suggest maybe putting a committee together to look at that behind the scenes and bring it back to one of our next meetings.
Absolutely.
Anything else, council, we've gone over quite a bit, but if we need things to be brought forward to us next time, or if we want to talk to items further tonight, we certainly have the opportunity. Any other questions or comments? Councilman Rauke?
Yeah, I just want to thank all the folks that have come out tonight. It's nice to see that there's more butts in the seat than normal. Usually it's a lot more thinner, so thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to end with what our next steps were, because they're important. We anticipate that at the next meeting in May, an agenda item for the council will be to adopt the maximum budget. What this means is it's not adopting the budget as presented, it's just adopting the maximum amount that we can spend, which is the $32 million. So that amount can go down, but it can't go up. So that's an important step, because then that allows us to publish in the newspaper. We have a statutory requirement to publish what those numbers are in the newspaper for 2 weeks. So by adopting the tentative, we can move forward with that publication. But again, there's still plenty of opportunity to make changes. It's not adopting the whole budget, it's just setting that amount. And then also, we would want to get some indication from the council on the telecommunications tax, because again, we have to notify the public and put out a public notice 60 days before the council is going to consider it at a public meeting. So, you know, there's a time element there. So we would hope that at the next council meeting, we can have that conversation and the dialogue with the council. And again, we want to have 2 more work study sessions whenever the council wants. We're available whatever day and time. We want to bring forward the fee schedule, give an opportunity at a work study session for the council to see what the fee schedule is, if there's any changes, what those changes are, as well as the pay plan, with the plan of adopting the final budget on June the 2nd and adopting the tax levy on June the 16th. And those are the last 2 meetings that we have scheduled before the end of the year.
And we are expecting the 2 meetings that we are added to the plan that's not on the pages yet. Will be on which dates?
We were hoping to do it on May 23rd and May 25th, but we have a couple of conflicts with the council. So again, you know, we'll make ourselves available whatever date we can get the majority of the council together.
And those would be special meetings similar to tonight,
Yes.
where the public's available to speak?
Right, we would allow public input at both meetings, yes.
Would there be any budgetary items on our next regularly scheduled council meeting?
Again, Mayor, that would be when you would adopt the tentative, the resolution to adopt the tentative maximum. I'm sorry, adopt the maximum, yes.
That's the 19th, I think it is?
Yes.
All right. All right. Thank you for going over those items. Anything else, council? Very good. Look for a motion to adjourn. All right, do we have a second? Second. All in favor, indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much.